I'm Dan Duncavage. Welcome to the briefing. Today we're going to ask a trillion-dollar question. Will NVIDIA and NVIDIA's GPU retain their hegemony over AI, particularly in the areas of inference? Or will the new challengers that are emerging supplant them? Before we can answer that question, let's take a quick run down memory lane of how we got here with the GPU. So it all started in 2010 with the GeForce GTX 580. This was called the Fermi architecture. And that began the CUDA baseline architecture of software for AI usage. The next big step was 2017, the Tesla V100 Volta architecture, which was 10x faster than the previous. Another big step happened in 2022 with the H100 Hopper architecture. That was 4 times the speed of the V100. Today we're on the Blackwell, and that is 20x what the H100 was. This forms the basis of over 90% of all of the AI training going on, at least in the non-China world. The question is, will that continue? And the big problem you run into is a thing called the memory wall. Now, the memory wall started about 6 years ago, 7 years ago almost, when we started to run into a problem of memory bandwidth being the limitation versus compute being the limitation. Now, this is in spite of the fact that NVIDIA's high bandwidth memory is incredibly fast, faster than any other large memory that's been done in the past. Now, this is important because on the inference side, in other words, when you talk to your LLM, you ask it a question, it has to then go ahead and do something based on what you asked it, and then all the web searching and other things that it's doing. That's the inference side of things. That is where you really run into the memory wall, less so in the training side where you're building up this model so it can then do things. So the memory wall has been attacked in a couple of different ways by some different companies. We're going to start with the language processing unit, the LPU. This was begun in 2016 by the founder of the TPU, who worked for Google at the time, split off, and he created a company called Groq, G-R-O-Q, not related to xAI's LLM, G-R-O-K, different entirely. So Groq created the language processing unit, which is a specialized AI inference chip. Interestingly, it is deterministic in its software as opposed to probabilistic, which is how a GPU works. The design is software first versus the GPU's dynamic scheduling. Now, the core architecture is a tensor streaming processor. Now, tensor math is built into the GPU, but in the LPU it is much more central to it. And instead of using a large quantity of memory that's tied in separately, all this memory is on chip as SRAM, static RAM, which is 10 times faster than any other kind of RAM. But it's much, much smaller. So instead of addressing, say, 80 gigabytes, it'll only address 230 megabytes. But it is much faster, as we'll discuss later. So the compiler pre-schedules the instructions and the data flow. It eliminates pretty much the memory wall for us and enables single pass parallelism, very low latency, very, very, very fast, and very low cost in terms of energy. So you're talking about 10x lower cost of power per token generated. It's also jitter-free. This is an important point. When you're simply exchanging text with an LLM, or you're asking it to do a larger task, the difference between one token and the next and its latency doesn't matter too much. But if you're talking to it and it talks really quickly and then talks slower, that's getting to be a problem there. And so jitter is what I'm referring to here, and the language processing unit is good for jitter. The next one is, this is fascinating, this is Cerebras. And their idea is a wafer-sized integration. So one whole 300 millimeter ingot turned into one wafer, one gigantic chip. No one's ever tried to do this before. Absolutely massive chip. And what this does is it bypasses all of the communication that has to go on between chips and chips and chips and memory and all these other kinds of things. So you get much, much greater speed in certain things. And this chip is massive. 4 trillion transistors. That's funny to even say. 4 trillion transistors. 900,000 cores. You look at the Macintosh I'm looking at right now. I think it's got, I think this has 12 CPU cores and 10 GPU cores. So 22. This is 900,000. That's just an absolutely astonishing amount. Now, you remember I mentioned 230 megabytes of SRAM on the LPU. This has 44,000 megabytes of SRAM. So incredibly powerful in this way. You can put the entire model on chip, up to 24 trillion parameters in these clusters. So this is really good for training. So it's massive on training and inference as well for frontier models. So the question is, what's the performance advantages? Well, these LPUs from Groq, they're ultra low latency, so they can be 10 or more times faster, particularly in terms of latency, than GPUs in benchmarks. It's deterministic for real-time apps. So if you want to use AI, think in the future AI needing to do something deterministic, like decide how to drive a car, or be able to have low latency for really good actual voice chatting. An LPU is very, very good for that kind of thing. Also lower energy, and energy is really where all the cost is. Now, these giant chips from Cerebras, that handles massive models without sharding and has much higher memory bandwidth. It bypasses a bunch of different bottlenecks. Now, the thing is, there are limitations here. The LPUs really are all about inference, so they're not as great for training. And training is, well, where you have to start with a AI. WSEs, these huge chips, they are costly, and they're also less flexible. So the question is, what's the forward path for NVIDIA? And is NVIDIA going to become stale? Is the GPU going to be supplanted? That's really unlikely. What you're going to see is hybrids. Now, NVIDIA paid $20 billion for an exclusive licensing agreement for Groq and brought on Groq's top people, including Jonathan Ross, the founding CEO. So what you're going to see is GPU and LPU co-processing here in the next year or so. GPUs are going to be more focused on the training side, LPUs on the decode and talk to you side of things. So that architecture is going to evolve. The next architecture is called Feynman. That'll come out in 2028. Feynman, named after, of course, the Nobel laureate, quantum mechanics, PhD. So you're going to see LPU like SRAM determinism maybe brought more into the GPUs, and there's already a little bit of that going on the Blackwell chips. But GPUs will remain relevant. Largely, you have an ecosystem lock-in with CUDA, so you'd have to redo a great deal to eliminate CUDA. So you're going to want to keep CUDA around. There's also the versatility of a GPU for training and inference and the massive scale. So the market share in the 90s now is likely to stay over 80% for the next 6 years or so. The hybrids will probably simply extend the dominance. So there'll be no full replacement of the GPUs, more like niche. Of course, this world is changing really quickly. The next question, of course, to ask is, well, will NVIDIA's profits stay strong, and will their stock price stay strong? And are there things in the further future that might challenge the dominance? We'll get to that on our next episode. For now, this is The Briefing. Thank you very much for watching. Please like and subscribe. Add to the comments. Thank you very much.